I was digging through some heavy academic texts on the history of madness recently, and I kept hitting the same wall. King Saul. It was almost weird how excited these researchers were to talk about him. Two of the books I picked up didn't even bother with a modern introduction. They went straight to the biblical retelling. They treated Saul like a long-lost medical record, a gotcha moment, to prove that mental illness isn't just a modern invention, but a permanent biological fixture of the human soul. To them, Saul's evil spirits were just ancient code for schizophrenia, a way to say, see. It's always been here. There's a certain satisfaction in that, right? The idea that we can reach back 3,000 years and find ourselves. But the more I looked at the details of Saul's life, the way he paced his palace, the way he obsessed over his young rival David, the more that tidy medical narrative started to feel like a forced fit. Saul didn't just get a disease that developed out of thin air. He was a man who had been told by the ultimate authority that he was an official failure, and he was watching his power vanish in real time. His insanity wasn't some mysterious physiological glitch. It was the raw human response of a despot who couldn't handle the stress of his own crumbling throne. The real turn, though, isn't in the diagnosis. It's in the hypocrisy. We call Saul mad for being paranoid about losing his crown, yet we call the prophet Samuel sane for claiming to hold two-way conversations with an invisible God. If we saw someone today claiming to receive execution orders from a divine voice, we'd have the straitjacket ready in seconds. Yet in the story of Saul, the man hearing voices is the hero, and the man reacting to intense pressure is the patient. It leaves you with this unsettling realization. We don't label people insane simply because their brains are malfunctioning. We do it because they've stopped being predictable. It makes you wonder if our entire modern concept of mental health is really just a 3,000-year-old habit of punishing the people who refuse to fall in line.
Yeah, that framing, it completely dismantles the conventional, highly medicalized approach we usually see applied to historical figures.
Right. Just feels so limiting.
Oh, it's incredibly limiting. The profound limitations of retroactively diagnosing someone from antiquity with modern clinical terms like, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or manic depression, it becomes glaringly obvious the moment you actually examine the socio-political landscape of the time.
Because the context matters.
Exactly. Madness is very frequently a social construct. It's utilized to explain and ultimately isolate those who fail to comply with the predictable norms of power.
Yeah.
So assigning a modern psychiatric label from the DSM to a Bronze Age monarch entirely obscures the actual vicious power dynamics at play. The concept of an individual possessing a physiologically malfunctioning brain simply did not exist in antiquity.
It wasn't even on their radar.
Therefore, projecting a medicalized framework onto these narratives is a historically flawed endeavor. It serves to validate modern psychiatric paradigms rather than accurately interpret the historical human experience.
Exactly. And, that is exactly why today on the Deep Dive, we are pulling from a massive stack of historical texts, theological history papers, behavioral psychology journals, and ancient philosophy.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We are going to figure out how we define insanity, how that definition has evolved or maybe hasn't evolved at all, and whether our modern clinical terminology is doing the exact same thing to people today that the ancient religious establishment did to King Saul.
Which is a heavy thought.
But to really grasp this, I want to take you into a scene that perfectly illustrates this non-medical interpretation. We have to strip away the sterile clinical terminology and actually put ourselves in the room.
Let's set that scene. The environmental context is so crucial for understanding his psychological state.
Right. So I want you to picture this. You are in the harsh, rugged Judean hills. It is night. The air is cold outside, and the only illumination inside this royal command tent comes from sputtering oil lamps.
Which just cast these long, erratic, heavy shadows against the canvas.
And Saul is sitting in the absolute deepest part of those shadows, and his eyes are completely fixed on the young David, who is sitting just a few feet away playing the lyre.
This is supposed to be music therapy, right?
Yeah, this is the ancient prescription for his dark moods. But I want you to think about the absolute psychological torture of this specific dynamic. Every single note David strikes on that instrument is not a comfort to Saul.
No, it operates like a ticking clock.
Yes. It is a relentless, inescapable acoustic reminder of his fading relevance and his vanishing authority.
Because the person administering the cure is the exact person causing the disease.
Saul is a man completely consumed by the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of status. He sits in that dimly lit tent, listening to the plucking of the strings, and he is obsessively replaying the songs he heard the women of the city singing.
Ah, the songs. In an ancient oral culture, a public song isn't just entertainment.
It's everything. It is the news broadcast, it is the historical record, and it is the absolute measure of public opinion.
And what was the song they were singing?
They were singing Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. He's sitting there doing the math of his own obsolescence. 1,000 for me. 10,000 for the kid playing the harp over there in the corner. Yes. And in that ancient world, they did not have clinical terms for narcissistic injury or severe status anxiety. The observers in the camp, the generals, the servants, they look at Saul and saw the physical manifestations of this stress. Well, they saw his hands trembling. They saw these sudden, terrifying, unpredictable outbursts of rage. They saw him withdraw into dark, uncommunicative moods. And they interpreted this through the only lens they had, a withdrawal of divine favor.
It was viewed as a moral vacuum where a king's ego used to reside.
Exactly. The evil spirit mentioned in the text is not a literal winged demon invading from the outside world. It's the suffocating atmospheric manifestation of Saul's own jealousy. It's the crushing physical weight of a crown he acutely feels slipping away from his grasp.
And when modern readers look back at that exact scene, they essentially replace the ancient word spirit with the modern word serotonin.
Right.
They say, his serotonin levels were depleted, he was having a depressive episode, but doing that completely misses the point. The narrative remains one of a man who simply could not survive his own loss of relevance.
It's so reductive.
By attempting to diagnose Saul retrospectively with a neurotransmitter deficiency, we miss the raw, deeply human tragedy of a leader who is breaking under the intense pressure of his own ambition.
I want to push on that concept of ambition for a second. Because we live in a society that glorifies ambition, but then seems to pathologize the inevitable stress that comes with it.
Absolutely.
Do your sources from ancient philosophy touch on this? Like, did anyone back then recognize that chasing power literally breaks the human mind without calling it a disease?
And this framing aligns remarkably well with ancient humanistic perspectives. We can actually look to ancient Chinese philosophy for a brilliant articulation of this, which completely bypasses the need for medicalized explanations of psychological suffering.
Interesting. Who are we looking at?
The philosopher Zhuangzi. His observations are incredibly profound and highly relevant here. Zhuangzi observed the rulers and the elites of his own time, which was a period of intense political instability and warfare, and he noted a distinct pattern.
Okay, what was the pattern?
He argued that individuals who fret over wealth and power literally wear their bodies out. They live in a state of constant worry. They spend their waking hours scheming, calculating, and wondering about their status in the hierarchy until they become dull and doddering.
So it's a physical toll.
Exactly. Their vital energy is entirely consumed by the maintenance of an illusion. It really highlights the depth of Chinese philosophical insight into human nature. They understood the mechanics of stress long before modern psychology.
So he saw the physical deterioration, the mental exhaustion, but he didn't call it a sickness.
Right. Zhuangzi viewed this not as a biological pathology, but as a bitter lot, a tragic, entirely predictable consequence of attaching one's peace of mind to external eminence. If your entire identity is predicated on being the most powerful person in the room, your psyche is inherently fragile because power is inherently unstable. Saul's descent mirrors this philosophical observation perfectly.
He's living it.
Yeah. He is a man wearing himself out over the preservation of a hierarchy that is actively rejecting him. The distress he experiences is the natural, logical, psychological consequence of an environment defined by the relentless pursuit and maintenance of absolute authority.
Okay, let's unpack this with a direct modern analogy so you can really feel the weight of this. Picture a modern CEO of a massive multinational corporation, or, a reigning monarch in a constitutional system.
Yeah.
This CEO has built the company. They're used to unquestioned authority, but now there is a young, highly charismatic, immensely popular vice president who is beginning to steal the spotlight.
Our modern-day David.
Exactly. The public adores the successor. The stock price jumps when the successor gives a presentation. Then the CEO starts noticing things. The board of directors begins having closed-door meetings.
Oh, that's never good.
Right. Executive assistants look away when the CEO walks down the hall. The established leader begins to genuinely suspect that their inner circle is plotting a transition of power.
Which, honestly, in the corporate world is a completely routine occurrence.
So the CEO becomes hypervigilant. They start checking emails at 3 in the morning, they lose sleep, they lash out and perceive slights in minor meetings. They become entirely consumed by the threat.
The stress is visibly manifesting.
Exactly. If we send that CEO to a psychiatrist today, they might be diagnosed with clinical paranoia or an acute anxiety disorder. But is it actually paranoia if it is an entirely accurate, rational assessment of a very real threat to one's survival and social status?
That is the crux of the issue. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that what we call paranoia, especially in environments of absolute zero-sum power, is often a highly tuned survival mechanism rather than a delusion.
Because a delusion has to be false.
A delusion is a false belief maintained despite contradictory evidence. Saul's belief that David was going to take his throne was not false, it was a fact.
Yeah, David had literally been secretly anointed to replace him.
Exactly. The board of directors, in this case, the religious establishment, was actively orchestrating a hostile takeover.
So his paranoia was actually just acute situational awareness.
100%. Ancient cultures did not possess a concept of the human brain misfiring chemically while the environment remained neutral. When historical texts describe someone being tormented by an evil spirit, they are using the cultural vocabulary available to them to describe severe, paralyzing emotional distress caused by their circumstances.
They're describing a reaction, not an illness.
Assigning modern medical diagnoses to these ancient texts is a retroactive projection. It assumes that our current medical epistemology, our way of categorizing human suffering, is a universal objective truth applicable across all eras.
Which is pretty arrogant, if you think about it.
And doing so willfully ignores the brutal environmental and social realities that generate extreme human behavior.
Well, let's talk about those brutal environmental realities. Because the physical space Saul inhabited played a massive role in this. The architecture of his daily life literally bred madness. I want to look at the specific physical and spatial environment of his royal residence to understand the architecture of his paranoia.
Okay, moving from the tent to the palace.
Yeah, let's step out of the tent in the hills and step into the palace at Gibeah.
A palace in the Bronze Age Levant is not a plush, comfortable European chateau. It is a military citadel.
Exactly. It is a fortified stone fortress. Think about the acoustics of a stone structure like that. There is absolutely no privacy.
Everything echoes.
Every footstep on the stone floors echoes down the hallways. Every distant, hushed conversation in the courtyard bounces off the walls. If you are already hypervigilant, an echoing stone corridor is a nightmare.
You'd be jumping at every sound.
Every distant whisper literally sounds like a conspiracy. Saul spends countless sleepless nights staring at the rough-hewn ceiling of his chambers, fully aware that while he is trapped in this stone box, his chosen successor, David, is out in the field gaining massive military victories and public adoration.
The spatial confinement amplifies the psychological confinement.
Exactly. He exhaustively scans the faces of everyone who walks into the throne room. He looks at his military commanders, his servants, even his own son, Jonathan.
Searching for what?
Searching for the slightest micro-expression of betrayal. And this suffocating, claustrophobic pressure cooker culminates in one of the most famous violent outbursts in the narrative, the Spear of Paranoia incident.
Right, where Saul actually attempts to murder David while David is playing the music.
Yes, Saul is holding a heavy bronze-tipped spear. It's not just a weapon. It is the symbol of his royal and military authority. David is playing the lyre. And in a moment of sheer, terrifying, explosive energy, Saul hurls the spear across the room, attempting to physically pin David to the stone wall. Now, the traditional medicalized reading of this event treats it like a sudden flare-up of a chemical imbalance. A synapse misfired, a psychotic break occurred, and he threw the spear.
But looking at the environmental buildup, that makes no sense.
None at all. This visceral, violent moment is the inevitable explosive reaction of a man who is psychologically hunted by his own absolute power.
He is cornered by his own crown.
He is surrounded by ghosts of his own making. He's trapped in a sociopolitical system where safety only exists if you are the absolute last person standing. There is no retirement plan for ancient kings.
You don't get a pension and a quiet country house?
No. You don't step down and join a think tank, you die. Usually violently. So his madness, his willingness to murder his best general, is entirely logical, albeit extreme response to the stress of maintaining absolute control while watching his entire social environment collapse around him.
We can rigorously analyze this environmental collapse using modern occupational psychology, specifically the occupational stress model developed by Karasek.
Wait, okay, before we put King Saul on the modern therapist couch and apply this, explain this Karasek model to me. What is the actual mechanism of occupational stress here? Break it down like I've never taken a psychology class.
Absolutely. So the Karasek model, also known as the demand control model, is a foundational theory in understanding workplace stress. It argues that psychological strain doesn't just come from having a hard job.
Okay.
It comes from a specific ratio, high demands combined with low control.
Give me an example.
Imagine two different stressful jobs. Job A is an emergency room trauma surgeon. The demands are astronomically high, literally life or death. However, the surgeon has high control. They have years of training, a team of nurses listening to their commands, and the authority to make split-second decisions.
So they're stressed, but they're in charge.
Exactly. They experience stress, but it is often active, engaging stress. Now imagine Job B, a worker on an incredibly fast-paced, modern assembly line. The demands are also high. They must process a widget every 3 seconds, or the whole line backs up.
But they can't stop the belt.
Right. They have absolutely zero control. They cannot slow the belt down. They cannot change the process. They cannot take a break when they need to. Karasek's model demonstrates that Job B is where severe psychological damage, burnout, and physical illness occur.
That makes total sense.
The human mind breaks when it faces overwhelming demands, but is stripped of the agency to address them.
Okay, so let's take that high demand, zero control assembly line dynamic and apply it to Saul's military situation. Because the demands placed on him were not just high, they were mathematically impossible.
Let us look at the specific historical crisis at Michmash. Saul is facing a massive invasion force of Philistines. The technological and numerical disparity is just terrifying.
The text described the enemy forces possessing 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. Let's pause and visualize that for a second. In the ancient world, a chariot is the equivalent of an armored tank.
It's a devastating weapon.
It is a high-speed, elevated firing platform for archers that absolutely crushes infantry lines. The sound of 30,000 chariots maneuvering would literally shake the earth and deafen the soldiers.
And the Philistines also had a massive technological edge.
Yeah, they had a monopoly on ironworking. They have iron swords and spears. And what does Saul have? Saul's core army consists of a mere 3,000 terrified men, mostly armed with bronze weapons or repurposed farming tools.
3,000 against 30,000 chariots.
The enemy foot soldiers are described as being as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So the environmental demands placed upon Saul as the commander-in-chief are astronomically high. He's looking at near certain defeat, the slaughter of his army, the destruction of his kingdom, and the enslavement of his people.
So the demand dial is cranked up to 1,000.
Now, what does this mean for his sense of control? If he were the trauma surgeon, he would immediately issue orders, set up defenses, and attack. But his ability to act is completely restricted by the religious establishment.
And this is where the control dial is turned to absolute zero. Saul is the king, he's the military commander, but he is explicitly, legally forbidden from taking any military action until the religious authority, the prophet Samuel, arrives to offer the official state sacrifices and provide the divine authorization for war.
And Samuel tells him, go to Gilgal and wait for me for 7 days. 7 days.
An eternity in wartime.
Imagine being a general, watching an armored tank division amass on your border, and you are ordered to sit on your hands for a week. During this week of forced paralysis, Saul is watching his already vastly outnumbered, poorly armed troops actively desert him.
They're just fleeing.
The texts say the Israelites were hiding in caves and thickets among the rocks and holes and in cisterns. They are fleeing across the Jordan River out of sheer, unadulterated terror. Saul is watching his entire defensive capability evaporate hour by hour. His control over the situation is mathematically zero.
That extreme control deficit is the psychological breaking point. It is the assembly line moving at triple speed while your hands are tied behind your back. When the 7th day finally arrives and expires, and Samuel has still not shown up, Saul makes a decision. He performs the burnt offering himself.
And this is usually preached as his great sin, right?
Yeah.
His arrogant rebellion against God.
But look at the psychology of the moment. This unauthorized sacrifice is not an act of arrogant religious disobedience. It is a desperate, highly illogical, executive attempt to regain a modicum of control over a rapidly deteriorating, catastrophic environment.
He's trying to stop the bleeding.
Exactly. His men are fleeing, the enemy is massing, morale is non-existent. He performs the ritual ritual to unify his deserting troops, to provide them with a psychological anchor of divine favor before they are completely overrun. He's doing exactly what a leader is supposed to do in a crisis, taking decisive action to prevent a massacre.
And the timing is what makes it so brutal. Because immediately after Saul finishes the sacrifice, literally as the smoke is still rising, Samuel arrives.
Yes.
And Samuel doesn't say, wow, things look dire, good job holding the line. He unequivocally, brutally condemns Saul. He essentially says, because you didn't wait, your kingdom will not endure.
This condemnation is the final fatal blow. You have the layer of extreme occupational stress, the layer of total lack of control, and now the absolute withdrawal of institutional legitimacy from his commanding authority. This sequence of events serves as the exact trigger for a textbook: stress-induced psychological collapse. Saul's subsequent erratic behavior, his profound paranoia, his deep depression, it all stems from this specific environmental catalyst.
It's not a genetic disease activate.
No, it is a human mind fracturing under an impossible load.
That dynamic between Saul and Samuel is fascinating, and it really requires a much deeper examination. Because if we look closely, it reveals a pattern of interpersonal sabotage that actively accelerated, if not entirely caused, this breakdown. We have to understand that Samuel was not a neutral, benevolent, religious observer simply reporting God's will.
Samuel was the established power.
Exactly. Before Saul, Israel wasn't a monarchy. It was a loose confederation of tribes led by judges, and Samuel was the ultimate judge. He was the supreme religious, judicial, and political authority, and he deeply, profoundly resented the very concept of a monarchy from the beginning.
It threatened his entire worldview.
The texts are clear about this. The people came to Samuel and demanded a king so they could be like the other nations. Samuel took this personally. He viewed this demand as a direct, insulting rejection of his own unique position of power and his life's work.
He was essentially forced by public pressure to install his own rival.
Yeah.
And we know from modern organizational psychology what happens when an entrenched executive is forced to train their own replacement against their will. That resentment translates directly into covert and sometimes overt psychological warfare. The ways Saul was systematically set up for failure are evident from his very first interactions with Samuel.
Let's look at the anointing. It's supposed to be this holy, clarifying moment. But Samuel makes it an absolute psychological maze.
Yes. Upon secretly anointing Saul, Samuel doesn't just say, "You are king, here is your administration." He provides a series of bizarre, highly convoluted, almost hallucinatory instructions. He tells Saul that as he travels, he will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb who will tell them about lost donkeys. Then he will go further and meet 3 men going up to Bethel carrying 3 young goats, 3 loaves of bread, and a skin of wine, and they will give him 2 loaves.
It's so specific.
Then he will meet a procession of prophets coming down from a high place with lyres and tambourines.
It sounds like a fever dream. Well, we give him all these incredibly specific, esoteric signs.
It is a classic manipulation tactic designed to overwhelm the subject's cognitive load and assert total dominance. By predicting these hyper-specific, mundane events, Samuel is establishing himself as an omniscient puppet master. He is showing Saul that every single detail of his reality is orchestrated by Samuel.
Wow.
But the real psychological violence comes at the end of these instructions. It culminates in a paralyzing double bind.
Clarify the double bind concept for the listener. What makes an instruction a double bind, and why is it so damaging?
A double bind is a dilemma in communication in which an individual receives 2 or more conflicting messages where one message negates the other. No matter how the person responds, they will be wrong.
You literally can't win.
Exactly. It creates a situation where successful resolution is impossible, leading to extreme anxiety and cognitive dissonance. Samuel tells Saul, "Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you."
Okay, so that's a directive for total autonomous executive action.
Right. But he immediately follows this by commanding, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to offer sacrifices. But you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do."
Wow. So do whatever you need to do. You have full authority.
Yeah.
But don't do anything until I get there and tell you what to do.
It is designed to be maddening. This contradictory messaging is engineered to keep the newly appointed king fundamentally off balance, eternally guessing and completely dependent on Samuel's validation. It strips Saul of his agency before he even takes the throne.
And the manipulation did not stop with private, confusing instructions. It extended to highly public, deeply damaging humiliation. Let's look at the public inauguration at Mizpah.
The casting of lots.
Even though Samuel had already secretly anointed Saul as king, poured the oil on his head, and told him he was chosen, Samuel later calls all the tribes of Israel together at Mizpah to publicly select the king by casting lots.
This is a critical detail that really needs context.
Right, because modern readers hear casting lots, and they think of drawing straws or winning a raffle. It sounds like a lottery. But in ancient Israel, the casting of lots using the Urim and Thummim, the sacred stones kept in the high priest's breastplate, was not a lottery. It was a rigorous, terrifying judicial tool utilized specifically to expose hidden criminals.
We see this exact same ritual used earlier in the historical text with the figure of Achan.
Achan stole cursed spoils of war, and the entire nation was punished. To find the guilty party, Joshua brought Israel forward by tribes, and the lot fell on the tribe of Judah. Then he brought the clans of Judah forward, and the lot fell on the Zerahites. Then the families, then the individuals, until Achan was exposed and immediately executed.
It's an interrogation tool.
It's a method of narrowing down suspects until the guilty man is isolated. So Samuel takes this criminal exposure ritual, a process associated with profound dread and public execution, and uses it to reveal the new king. He brings forward the tribes, the lot falls on Benjamin. He brings the clans, the lot falls on Matri. He brings the individuals, and it falls on Saul.
By using a criminal exposure ritual to reveal the monarch, Samuel immediately prejudices the entire public against Saul. He framed the inauguration of the monarchy not as a glorious celebratory new era, but as the grim identification of a guilty party.
The psychological atmosphere was one of suspicion, not coronation. And the text mentioned that when the lot fell on Saul, they couldn't find him. He was hiding among the baggage. Often, this is preached as Saul being humble or shy. But if you understand the context of the lots, he wasn't shy, he was terrified.
He knew exactly what that ritual meant.
He knew this was the exact ritual used to identify people who were about to be stoned to death. He knew he was being set up. This entire sequence highlights the lethal, corrosive nature of toxic mentorship. Think about Saul's starting point. He began as an unconfident farmer. When Samuel first approached him, Saul explicitly questioned his own worthiness, pointing out he was from the smallest tribe and the least of the clans. He did not seek this office.
He is suddenly elevated to a position of absolute, terrifying power, burdened with the survival of a nation, yet he is rendered entirely dependent on a mentor who actively, strategically desires his failure.
The biblical narrative describes the tragic turning point as the departure of the spirit from Saul. It says, the spirit of the Lord left him, and an evil spirit tormented him.
But if we translate that ancient theological language into sociological and psychological realities,
this departure can be understood as the total, devastating withdrawal of social, structural, and institutional support. Samuel systematically strips Saul of his legitimacy, isolates him from his allies, creates impossible double binds, publicly humiliates him, and then irrevocably withdraws his endorsement. The spirit leaving is the safety net being cut. Anyone would lose their mind in that freefall.
This brings us to a profound and stark contradiction in how extreme mental states are labeled and judged by society, both ancient and modern. We have been examining Saul. We see him pacing the echoing halls of his stone fortress, overwhelmed by anxiety, crippled by insomnia, and plagued by a very real paranoia about losing his throne to a rival heavily backed by the religious establishment.
And the ancient texts unequivocally label him as mad.
They say he is tormented by an evil spirit. And for thousands of years, readers and historians have accepted the premise that he was clinically, objectively insane.
Right. But then we turn the page, we look at the prophets of the exact same era, and we apply a completely different, wildly hypocritical standard.
The standard is entirely inverted.
Let's look at the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel reports having vivid, waking hallucinations. He describes the sky tearing open. He sees 4 terrifying living creatures with 4 faces, each human, lion, ox, and eagle. He sees massive, glowing, flying rings or wheels operating within wheels, and the rims of these wheels are completely covered in living eyeballs.
Sounds pretty intense.
He falls face down in the dirt, paralyzed by these visions. Or let's look at Samuel himself. Samuel claims to hold direct, literal, two-way conversations with an invisible God. He receives highly detailed, uncompromising instructions on statecraft, the selection of kings, and military execution orders, sometimes demanding the total annihilation of rival cities.
In any modern context, auditory hallucinations commanding military executions would be immediate grounds for institutionalization.
Exactly. If a CEO today held a press conference and said, an invisible voice told me to fire my VP and completely destroy our rival company, we wouldn't just fire them, we would have the straitjacket ready in seconds. So the question we have to ask is, why are Ezekiel's bizarre sensory experiences and Samuel's auditory hallucinations considered sacred divine gifts and the absolute hallmark of brilliant sanity, while Saul's acute situational anxiety is labeled a demonic evil spirit and definitive proof of his madness?
This contradiction raises one of the most important questions of our deep dive. It points directly to the function of madness as a mechanism for social compliance. The thesis here, supported by extensive sociological critique, is that the label of madness depends almost entirely on whether the individual's extreme behavior serves the prevailing establishment. The prophets, when their visions, no matter how bizarre or detached from consensus reality, align with the reinforcement of religious authority and the overarching theological narrative, are deemed pure conduits of divine truth. Their symptoms are canonized.
Because their visions support the power structure.
Sanity, in these historical contexts, is functionally synonymous with obedience, usefulness, and predictability. The moment an individual, whether they are a crowned king or a wandering prophet, becomes antagonistic to the reigning power structure, their mental state is immediately aggressively pathologized.
It's a label of convenience.
The designation of madness is deployed not as a medical diagnosis, but as a political weapon to invalidate their actions, discredit their speech, and remove their agency.
And you don't even have to look at kings to see this political weapon in action. You can look at what happens when a prophet steps out of line. You can see the brutal physical reality of this arbitrary line in the historical fate of the prophet Jeremiah.
Jeremiah is the perfect test case for this theory.
Jeremiah was a prophet. He experienced visions. He heard the divine voice. He utilized the exact same ecstatic prophetic vocabulary as Samuel or Ezekiel. He was fully participating in the accepted religious framework. However, the content of his message changed.
The politics shifted.
Yeah, the political establishment in Jerusalem was confident. They believed they were divinely protected and could withstand the siege of the Babylonian Empire. But Jeremiah delivered the deeply unwelcome, deeply unpatriotic prophecy that Jerusalem was going to fall. He walked through the streets wearing a wooden yoke around his neck to symbolize the coming enslavement to Babylon. He told the soldiers to surrender. He told the king that the city would burn.
He was contradicting the state's military optimism during a time of existential crisis.
And how did the establishment react? He was not celebrated for his divine connection. The priest didn't say, well, he hears the voice of God, we must listen. No.
Yeah.
Because the message was inconvenient, his prophetic status was instantly revoked. He was arrested. He was physically beaten by the chief officer of the temple.
Stripped of his authority completely.
He was placed in public stocks at the Upper Benjamin Gate for everyone to mock. And eventually, the royal officials accused him of treason, claiming his words were discouraging the soldiers. They took him and threw him into the muddy cistern of Malchia, a dark, suffocating, waterless pit in the courtyard of the guard. He sank into the deep mud, and he was left there with the explicit expectation that he would starve to death.
The shift in his treatment is purely based on the utility of his message.
Exactly. Ezekiel sees glowing wheels covered in eyeballs, and he is a holy prophet whose writings are preserved for eternity. Jeremiah sees the geopolitical reality that the city is falling, and he is locked in a muddy hole to starve like an absolute lunatic. The only difference between divine inspiration and dangerous madness was whether the ruling elite liked the message.
That's the reality of the situation.
His visions were no longer divine. They were treated as a dangerous, treasonous deviance. His madness was simply the act of delivering bad news that the political establishment violently refused to hear. The label of sanity shifts the exact moment the individual becomes inconvenient.
If we synthesize these historical threads, we see a distinct, undeniable pattern regarding the social function of psychiatry, long before psychiatry had a name. Saul is condemned, diagnosed with an evil spirit, and deemed mad because he attempts to act independently, performing a sacrifice to save his army without the religious establishment that installed him.
And Jeremiah is tortured and imprisoned in a cistern because his realistic prophecies undermine the state's military confidence.
Right. The categorization of the human mind in these ancient texts is not in any way an objective medical assessment of cognitive function. It is a highly effective political tool. The evil spirit is simply a theological justification for the removal of a non-compliant executive. Madness is the cage we build for the unpredictable.
And this is where the conversation gets truly uncomfortable, because this political and moral categorization of the mind did not end in antiquity. It didn't disappear when we stopped using the phrase evil spirit. I want to bring this historical analysis directly into the present day. Step out of the ancient stone palaces and the muddy cisterns. Step inside a modern psychiatric ward for a second.
The contrast in aesthetics is sharp, but the underlying mechanisms are remarkably similar.
Exactly. Look at the modern ward. The lighting is stark, fluorescent, and unforgiving. There are no shadows to hide in. The environment is aggressively sterile, devoid of personal comfort or sharp edges, designed entirely for continuous observation and behavioral containment. The patient is wearing identical paper-thin scrubs.
It's designed for control.
Now focus on the heavy physical weight of an orange prescription bottle resting in that modern patient's hand. On the surface, this is a triumph of science. We have isolated neurotransmitters. We have synthesized compounds. But talk to that patient.
Their internal experience is very different.
That patient, sitting on the edge of the institutional bed, feels the crushing, unspoken, heavy judgment of their family, their colleagues, and their community. They have internalized their clinical diagnosis, their depression, their anxiety, their executive dysfunction, not merely as a neutral biological reality like a broken arm or asthma. They have internalized it as a moral failure, as a fundamental lack of willpower.
They feel responsible for their own inability to cope.
Yes. They feel the exact same profound, isolating shame that Saul felt pacing his quarters. The sense that their condition, their inability to function efficiently in the system, is a punishment for not being strong enough, or resilient enough, or compliant enough.
It's a heavy burden.
This internalized shame is the lingering ghost of Saul. It is the haunting realization that a modern medical diagnosis, wrapped in the impressive, unassailable language of neurotransmitters, double-blind clinical trials, and genetic predispositions, often serves as a polite, socially acceptable, secular disguise for divine or social rejection.
We medicalize the rejection.
We look at the modern ward and we see scientific progress. But the patient sitting on that bed often feels the exact same moral excommunication as the ancient king who lost his crown. They feel they have been judged and found wanting.
To understand how we arrived here, we can trace how this moral judgment survived, mutated, and evolved through the centuries, specifically looking at the Middle Ages. Medieval medicine actually represented a complex, fascinating bridge between ancient theology and what we consider modern psychiatry. It wasn't just a dark age of superstition.
Really? Because the stereotype of the Middle Ages is just exorcisms and witch burnings.
Certainly, but the mainstream medical establishment, heavily influenced by Galen and Islamic scholars, operated on the theory of humorism. They recognized physical, biological causes for madness. They believed that an imbalance of the four humors, specifically an excess of black bile, caused melancholia and madness.
So they were looking at the body.
They understood that external environment, poor diet, lack of sleep, and extreme emotional stress directly impacted the physical body and the mind.
So they were looking for biological causes, just like we do today.
And because they saw a physical link, they utilized physical treatments. They prescribed changes in diet, herbal purgatives, bloodletting to balance the humors, and occupational therapy. They heavily utilized music therapy to soothe the agitated mind, which, of course, directly mirrors David playing the lyre for Saul thousands of years earlier.
Oh, history repeating itself.
However, and this is the critical caveat, despite this robust recognition of physical and environmental factors, the overarching, inescapable societal belief firmly remained that madness was ultimately a direct punishment for sin.
So the body was sick, but the soul was guilty.
Exactly. The physical treatments were applied to alleviate the symptoms, but the moral judgment was paramount. If you had an excess of black bile, it was likely because you had engaged in the sin of sloth or despair, or you had turned away from God. The individual was still fundamentally flawed on a spiritual level. The disease was the physical manifestation of a moral failing. The stigma remained identical to the ancient world.
So we take that medieval concept, treating the mind while judging the soul, and we fast forward to modern therapies. Let's look at the absolute gold standards of modern mental health care, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT or traditional psychoanalysis.
Okay.
In these settings, we use highly sanitized, clinical, objective language. We don't talk about sin or demons. We talk about fixing faulty thinking, correcting maladaptive emotional responses, or addressing inappropriate desires. We talk about identifying cognitive distortions. But when you rigorously deconstruct the core mechanism of these therapies, does it fundamentally differ from what the medieval doctors or the ancient priests were doing?
The terminology has undergone a complete secular revolution, but the core objective remains remarkably consistent.
I would argue it remains an act of moral purification. Think about the premise of CBT. You are stressed, depressed, or anxious. The therapy dictates that your feelings are caused by your distorted thoughts about the environment, not necessarily the environment itself.
It centers the problem within the individual.
We are diagnosing a deviance from the accepted productive norm. We are demanding that the unpredictable, deeply distressed individual actively change the internal, invisible architecture of their own mind to fit the relentless demands of a highly structured, hyperproductive society.
The onus of adaptation is placed entirely on the sufferer.
Yes, if you are exhausted and depressed because you work 60 hours a week, commute 2 hours a day, and still can't afford a mortgage, the therapy often doesn't say, your environment is toxic and exploitative, your depression is a highly accurate read of a terrible situation. It says, let's work on reframing your catastrophizing thoughts about your workload.
It individualizes systemic issues.
We demand the individual restructure their cognition rather than demanding society make structural, material accommodations for human distress. The language has successfully changed from sin to pathology, from religious repentance to cognitive restructuring. But the ultimate demand for compliance, for the individual to simply get back to work and stop being a problem, remains absolutely identical.
The underlying logic is undeniably, uncomfortably similar. The therapeutic intervention operates almost exclusively on the premise that the distress is located entirely within the individual's faulty internal mechanisms.
Right.
By focusing inward, the therapy inadvertently absolves the broader environment, the exploitative workplace, the unforgiving economic system, the rigid social hierarchy, the isolating community design of its massive role in generating that distress. Just as King Saul was blamed and pathologized for his inability to peacefully cope with the impossible, contradictory demands of his collapsing kingdom and his toxic mentor, the modern individual is tasked with constantly repairing and optimizing their own cognition simply to survive within systems that may be inherently, structurally, psychologically damaging.
The analogy is stark, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You look at the modern therapist sitting in an office holding the DSM, the diagnostic manual. They are functioning in a societal role that is remarkably historically similar to the ancient priest or the village shaman.
They hold the authority to define reality.
Both are tasked by their respective societies with a very specific job identifying the deviance in the individual. Both apply a highly localized, specialized, culturally sanctioned ritual. Whether that ritual is a burnt offering on an altar, a medieval confession, or a recurring 50-minute session of behavioral modification, the architecture of the interaction is the same.
It's a ritual of normalization.
The rituals is designed to bring the outcast back into behavioral compliance. The goal of the priest and the therapist is to make the individual predictable again. It is to ensure they can return to the workforce, return to the nuclear family unit, and function quietly within the established, accepted parameters of normal behavior without disrupting the economic or social order.
The deep dive into these diverse historical, philosophical, and psychological sources reveals a profound continuity. It shows that the architecture of mental illness discourse has barely changed over 3 millennia. From the goat hair tents of the Judean hills to the modern, sterile clinical office, society consistently utilizes the concept of madness to manage, marginalize, and explain away those who are unpredictable, deeply distressed, or antagonistic to the established power.
It's an unbroken chain.
The terminology continually evolves. We move from evil spirits to unbalanced humors to chemical imbalances and cognitive distortions. But the primary underlying function remains deeply embedded in how human civilization operates. Enforcing social compliance and individualizing systemic environmental stress remains the primary way we handle the complexities of the human mind.
Which brings us back, finally, to the king in the shadows. The tragedy of Saul is not a story of a medical anomaly, it is not a genetic misfire, and it is certainly not a biological disease that struck him out of the blue, independent of his world. It is a deeply painfully human story. It is the story of a man crushed by the impossible zero-sum demands of absolute power. It is the story of a leader manipulated, confused, and set up by a mentor who desperately wanted him to fail. And ultimately, it is the story of a human being destroyed by the total catastrophic withdrawal of his society's grace. It is a reminder that when we open that long-lost medical record from 3,000 years ago, we aren't seeing the biological origins of a disease. We are seeing a mirror of our own relentless habit of punishing the people who refuse to fall in line.